Welcome back, David Sorkin, to Brown this evening. This is the second lecture he's giving as the BJS Visiting Scholar for 2016. And the lecture that he gave 2 weeks ago and this one will be part of a book that explores the relationship between Jews and the French Revolution. And this book will be published as a broader study of assimilation. David Sorkin is currently the Lucy J. Moses Professor of Modern Jewish History at Yale University, and he is the author of 4 important monographs, as well as several collections of essays, equally important actually. David has had a transformative impact on the profession of Jewish and European history for a number of reasons. He asks big questions, and his work challenges the accepted orthodoxies of the profession. When I was thinking of David's work, George Lukács's remark came to mind. It's a remark I came across in the archives while I was working on Lukács. And the remark was this. According to Lukács, every significant thinker had only one question that they asked over and over again in different ways during their lives. And I think that this applies to David as well. His question is that of Jewish assimilation and the nature of Jewish secular life in modern Europe. He asked this question in every book that he has written. He explored different aspects of this problem in all of his 4 books that I'm just going to mention very briefly. The first, the transformation of German Jewry, 1840, which came out in 1987. His second, Moses Mendelssohn and the Religious Enlightenment, 1996. His third, Berlin Haskalah and the German Religious Thought, 2000. And his most recent and most ambitious book, The Religious Enlightenment, Protestants, Jews, and Catholics, from London to Vienna, and that came out in 2008. His present lecture forms part of an ambitious project to rethink the story of Jewish assimilation in the entire pre-modern and modern period. And I think that he is, and it became clear from the seminar he gave this noon, he's rethinking the nature of Jewish assimilation in a new way and formulating it not as a story of failure or achievement, but rather as a secular story of re-engagement with the same questions under different historical conditions. Tonight's lecture is part of this broader attempt to reframe the story of Jewish assimilation. And it's called The Forgotten Connection, Napoleon, Sundenran, and in the light of the Civic Code. David, it's a pleasure to welcome you again.
Thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction and all the very generous things that you said about me. I do want to add one thing, which is my son thinks is far more important than anything I've written or lectured about. He reminded me that there's a practice at Brown of designating people as the parents of Brown students. So I am a P07, and my son Gideon has the distinction of having had me pay for 5 years of tuition at Brown, while he did 2 degrees, a BS in engineering and a BA in architecture studies. Okay. So, as Mary has said, the lectures, my 2 lectures in my seminar are revisiting the question of emancipation of the Jews in France. And the purpose of these lectures in the seminar is to complicate our understanding of emancipation. There's something of a myth that's formed around emancipation of the Jews in France, and particularly the French Revolution. And what I'm trying to do is to restore contingency to the myth which has simplified those events. So in the first lecture, I examined the debate of December 23rd, 1789, and the two decrees that gave Jews equality, first on January 28, 1790 for the Sephardic Jews of the Southwest, then on September 27, 1791 for the Ashkenazic Jews of the Northeast. And I tried to show that that famous debate of 1789 was accidental, that the first decree of 1790 was not revolutionary in the least, but was rather an extension of corporate privilege, and that the second decree was really about the Constitution and was the unfinished business of a lame duck legislature. In today's seminar, I tried to show that emancipation didn't come to a conclusion with the Revolution, but in fact continued all the way down to 1780, especially if we take account of Algeria, which is usually left out of the story altogether. Now this evening, I'd like to offer a new view of Napoleon's Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin of 1806 to 1808, and the so-called infamous decrees, the discriminatory legislation that Napoleon enacted that was in place from 1808 until 1818. Now, usually the scholarship on the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin has one of two foci. The first is that many historians have focused on Napoleon's attitude towards the Jews in general and the Jews of Alsace and the Northeast in particular, trying to ascertain Napoleon's motives, especially the extent to which he was or was not anti-Semitic, or the extent of his anti-Semitism, and the immediate causes for calling the assembly. The second focus is that historians have scrutinized the relationship of the assembly and the Sanhedrin's decisions to Jewish law, to halakha, endeavoring to determine to what extent they upheld halakha or submitted obsequiously to Napoleon or, in fact, defiantly resisted his pressure. So those are the two ways that people usually look at these events, looking at whether Napoleon was anti-Semitic or in what ways he was anti-Semitic, or whether the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin upheld halakha or caved in. In contrast, I'd like to examine the Assembly's relationship to the civil code, the new law code that Napoleon had introduced in 1804 and which then came to be called the Napoleonic Code in 1807. This is what I would call the forgotten connection that explains the questions that Napoleon's ministers put to the Jews at the Assembly of Notables. And the real question was, could the Jews be part of Napoleon's France as legislated by the code? Okay? Now, my talk's going to be divided into 5 parts. I'm first going to give an introduction that sets the scene and establishes what the questions are. Then we'll look at the Assembly of Notables. This is going to be the longest section, and there's going to be a handout in which we look at the 12 questions that hold on to it, the 12 questions that Napoleon's ministers put to the Jews. Then we'll look at the Sanhedrin very briefly. Then we'll come back to the Assembly of Notables, and then I'll have a brief conclusion. Okay, so we'll begin with the introduction, which sets the scene. Okay, after the Revolution's years of tumult, Napoleon set out to stabilize France in order to establish his own autocratic and ultimately imperial rule. Napoleon in general aspired, as he put it, to, quote, finish with the romance of the Revolution and see what is realistic and possible in its principles, end of quote. One part of that effort was to resolve the Revolution's conflicts over religion, which he accomplished through the Concordat with the papacy in 1801 and the institution of the Protestant Consistoire in 1802. So first of all, he puts an end to the conflicts with Catholics and Protestants. Another part was to impose a uniform law code for civil society, which he attained with the promulgation of the Civil Code in 1804, later renamed the Napoleonic Code in 1807. In regard to the Jews, Napoleon merged these two efforts by convening an assembly of Jewish notables in 1806, and then, in his typically grandiose manner, a Sanhedrin in 1808 named for the ancient tribunal. Napoleon considered full and unconditional emancipation for the Jews of Alsace, as one of his advisors formulated it, as an act of unwise generosity that demanded reconsideration. Passing through Strasbourg in January 1806, Napoleon heard savage complaints about the Jews' usury, greed, and creeping domination, and without bothering to hear from the Jews themselves, told his ministers in the Council of State 3 months later that the Jews were, quote, a nation within a nation, whose numbers should be limited and commercial activities restricted. In consequence, Napoleon ordered a 1-year suspension of Jewish loans on May 30th, 1806. So this was an infringement on the Jews' citizenship. Yet he wanted the Jews themselves to agree to and give him legal justification for more far-reaching discriminatory legislation, an intention he, of course, kept secret. As a further piece, Napoleon's code played a critical role in his effort to make France stable and governable. The revolutionaries had tried to replace the Ancien regime's corporate structure, in which the nobles, the clergy, the bourgeoisie, and the peasants all had their own separate and distinct privileges, with the cohesion of the egalitarian family. Revolutionary law had diminished parental authority, given women juridical equality in some realms, and introduced liberal conditions for divorce. The family, conceived as a legal contract between equals or virtual equals, was to serve under the Revolution as both legal matrix and social cement, bonding each individual to the nation. Napoleon's code replaced the revolution's egalitarian vision with a domestic monarchy. The code envisioned a new alliance of the state, father, and conjugal family, in which the male head of household alone was the juridical individual. Women lost their juridical stand. The wife was subordinate to her husband through the revived Ancien regime notion of marriage as a relationship of duties and rights, and divorce was rendered virtually unobtainable. The state was this patriarchal family writ large. In Napoleon's words, quote, as the head of the family is absolutely at the disposition of the government, so is the family absolutely at the disposition of its head. Napoleon's code, so one thing is Napoleon's code redefines the notion of the family, and the nation is the family writ large. It is patriarchal and also monogamous. Napoleon's civil code, second, redefined the criteria of citizenship in keeping with the patriarchal family. The revolution had continued the Ancien regime practice of citizenship by birthplace or residence. This is the tradition of jus soli. And in the handout, you'll be able to see this on paper. The laws of April 30th to May 2nd, 1790, for example, under the Revolution, had stipulated 5 years of continuous residence as a condition of citizenship. The Revolution had abolished harsh laws of inheritance, the laws of escheat, as they were known, which meant that if you were a foreigner and you died in France, the state could seize all of your assets. And also eased the law of naturalization. To be French was, quote, to be a man or woman who was born in France and continues to live there. So residence was the criterion for citizenship. The Civil Code introduced the principle of descent, jus sanguinis. To be French was to be, quote, a child born to a French father. The law posited that the nation as the sole source of the quality of being French. The nation was a family that transmitted its name through parentage. This revival of Roman law, quote, inaugurated the era of modern nationality law in France and throughout Europe, close quote, as Napoleon exported the code under his soldiers' bayonets. Okay. Now we come, so that's the introduction that sets the scene. This is what Napoleon's code does. It introduces a new notion of the family, the monogamous patriarchal family, and a new notion of citizenship based on descent rather than citizenship based on residence. Okay. Second part, now we come to the Assembly of Notables. Napoleon's ministers posed 12 questions to the 111 delegates, laymen and rabbis drawn from France and the Kingdom of Italy, who comprised the Assembly of Notables. The questions aimed to ascertain far more than whether Jews could live in conformity with the letter of the law of the new Civil Code. The Civil Code had changed the rules of the game. The question Napoleon's ministers asked was whether Jews could now claim a place in that game. Did Jews who had gained citizenship under the revolutionary law of birthplace and residence deserve to retain it under the law of descent? Could Jews, whom Napoleon regarded as a nation within a nation, be citizens of a France defined by the patriarchal family and understood as a family writ large? The very language in which Napoleon conceived of the assembly unmistakably signaled this situation. He understood himself to be convening, quote, the Estates General of the Jews. That is, the Ancien Regime, or pre-revolutionary corporate body that predated the revolution. In his mind, the Jews' citizenship had effectively been annulled. Napoleon's commissioners, on July 29, 1806, set a threatening tone for the assembly with a brief address presenting the delegates with the 12 questions. Acknowledging the complaints that had reached the throne, the head commissioner emphasized Napoleon's paternal goodwill in convening such an assembly that, quote, has no precedent in the annals of Christianity. Yet he also bared the emperor's fist, quote, the wish of his majesty is that you should be Frenchmen. It remains with you to accept of the proffered title, without forgetting that to prove unworthy of it would be renouncing it altogether. Okay, now we can pass out the handout. Okay, what Mary is going to pass out is a copy of the 12 questions that Napoleon's ministers put to the Assembly of Notables. And we're going to go through those questions in 4 groups. Okay, so first look at the first 3 questions. Okay, questions 1, 2, 3. Okay, don't go beyond question 3. Okay? All right, the first 3 questions address the foundational issue of whether the Jews could be members of the family that the Civil Code made the basic cell of Napoleon's France. Is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Monogamy and polygamy. Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid, although not pronounced by courts of justice and by virtue of laws in contradiction with the French Code? Right? So the Napoleonic Code has basically done away with divorce. Are Jews going to allow it? Can a Jewess marry a Christian or a Jew a Christian woman? Or has the law ordered that the Jews should only intermarry among themselves? Right? The first question was crucial for the patriarchal family's success. that family was predicated on monogamy. Polygamy was then an inadmissible challenge to society's legal framework and morality. Indeed, later in the century, French colonial authorities would raise the same questions about Jews and cite polygamy as a cause to deny citizenship to Muslims in Algeria. The second question aimed to defend the Civil Code's drastic reduction of divorce. Revolutionary legislation of 1792 had introduced divorce for the first time, making it accessible by admitting a variety of causes: abuse or cruelty, insanity or criminal behavior, mutual consent or incompatibility, desertion, and emigration. The Civil Code ended those liberties by so heavily restricting the permissible causes for divorce, and especially the wife's ability to file, that divorce became virtually unobtainable. To give you one example, a woman could not sue for divorce just because her husband was having an affair. She could only sue for divorce if the husband brought his mistress into the household and have her living there. That was patriarchal monogamy. In order to integrate Jews into the patriarchal family, Napoleon's ministers had to determine that the Jews would not allow divorces, quote, in contradiction with the French Code. The third question linked the crucial issues of marriage and citizenship. The ministers asked whether Jews were willing to join the nation defined by the descent, and you can see the two different forms of citizenship listed at the bottom, jus soli and jus sanguinis, through marrying into the French family. If the delegates rejected intermarriage, either in principle or in practice, then they were refusing to become part of the French family of blood. Napoleon not merely refused to countenance compromise on this issue, he contemplated enacting coercive legislation, namely requiring every third marriage to be an intermarriage. Napoleon was adamant that Jews cease to be a nation within a nation and join the French family. In formulating answers to the first three questions, the Assembly of Notables became a working body in which, to the commissioners' surprise, and perhaps the delegates as well, the small number of rabbis began to play a critical role. Napoleon's prefects had chosen the delegates. They weren't elected. This was oligarchical, undemocratic, legislated from above. The majority were lay notables, namely landholders and other distinguished Jews. Some 15 of the 111 delegates were rabbis. The delegates had elected as president Abraham Furtado, a wealthy Jew from Bordeaux with extensive experience in Jewish and municipal politics. After Furtado fulsomely recognized the emperor's plan in calling the assembly to, quote, hasten the regeneration of some of our brethren and to completely reform habits occasioned by a long state of oppression, he appointed a committee of 12 to draft answers. The committee included 4 rabbis, especially David Sinsheim of Strasbourg. Napoleon's commissioners discerned a division in the assembly between a philosophic camp with Furtado at its head and a rabbinic one whose leadership Sinsheim quickly assumed. It was to be Sinsheim's enduring achievement to forge a consensus between the camps. Sinsheim was uniquely positioned to achieve that consensus. He was the brother-in-law, the wealthy brother-in-law of a notable from Alsace, and he himself, and he had served as one of 2 Jewish delegates from Alsace to the pre-revolutionary Estates General and co-authored a number of petitions to the National Assembly. In addition, he directed a Talmudical academy, a yeshiva, in Strasbourg, and was a celebrated authority on Jewish law whose legal commentaries were respected by rabbis throughout Europe. It was in regard to the crucial third question, the question about marriage and intermarriage, that he became the leading voice on Jewish law. On August 4th, The Committee of 12 presented its answers to the first 3 questions. The committee offered a general preface in which it declared that on the basis of Jewish law, the delegates recognized the supremacy of civil law over religious law. The delegates asserted that according to the halachic dictum, the law of the land is law, or dina de malchuta dina, quote, it is their duty to consider the law of the prince as the supreme law in civil and political matters. Should their religious code contain civil or political commands at variance with those of the French code, those commands would of course cease to influence and govern them, since they must, above all, acknowledge and obey the laws of the prince. The committee thus announced its allegiance both to Jewish law and Napoleon's civil code, as well as its conviction that the two could not conflict. To be sure, the delegates innovated by extending the dictum's application, dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is law, from physical matters, its purview in previous centuries, to civil law and family law. The rabbis understood this, however, as a permissible adjustment to new circumstances, and indeed, since Heim corresponded with leading rabbis throughout Europe to see whether they would agree that this was a permissible innovation, and indeed, most of them, in fact, agreed. This reconciliation of civil and Jewish law was to be foundational for the Jews' status as citizens. The ideology of the Sanhedrin, and it came to be called, became integral to the attainment and retention of citizenship in France and across the continent. And indeed, if you look at the Second Reform Assembly of Rabbis in Germany in 1844, one of the first things that assembly did was to confirm the decision of the Sanhedrin about the superiority of civil law to Jewish law. The committee's answers to the first 2 questions were relatively straightforward. Jews would conform to the civil code and the new patriarchal family. Mosaic law is ambiguous about polygamy, neither commanding nor forbidding it. Jews in the East, especially wealthy ones, had taken multiple wives. In the West, a synod forbade it in the 11th century, and that practice has since prevailed. And of course, that ruling is about to expire. Similarly, the civil code's restrictions on divorce, because it was enacted for a millennium. Similarly, the civil code's restrictions on divorce would not pose a problem. Jewish law allows a husband to pursue divorce, but in the past this was rarely practiced. Since the Revolution, Jews have conformed to French law. Therefore, religious divorce requires prior civil divorce. Civil and religious divorce combined break all bonds between husband and wife. The controversial question of intermarriage elicited separate answers from the lay delegates and rabbis. These were reconciled through juxtaposition rather than synthesis. The lay delegates emphasized the permissibility of marriages with Christians. Biblical law prohibited marriages with, quote, nations in idolatry, not with fellow monotheists. And of course, even though Jews well into the Middle Ages considered Christians to be idolaters, under the influence of, because of the Trinity, under the influence of Kabbalah, as Jews began to see, of Jewish mysticism, as Jews began to see multiple aspects of the Godhead, they then began to see Christians no longer as idolaters. But that's another story. The rabbis, in contrast, insisted that they could not sanctify a mixed marriage, and in a very cheeky way, claimed agreement with Catholic priests. Quote, such is the opinion of the rabbis, members of this assembly. In general, they would be no more inclined to bless the union of a Jewess with a Christian or of a Jewish with a Christian woman than Catholic priests themselves would be disposed to sanction unions of this kind. End of quote. Nevertheless, the rabbis reiterated the preface's principle of the supremacy of civil law. they recognized that a civil law, a civil marriage, was binding. Moreover, a Jew who engaged in such a marriage did not, on that account, cease to be a Jew. Here was a boldly candid answer to whether Jews could join a France defined by family and blood, jus sanguinis. The rabbis stubbornly resisted Napoleon's commissioners' formidable pressure. As a result, the commissioners began to take the rabbis seriously, realizing that they would formulate the answer to any issue that touched on Jewish law or halakha. In contrast, Napoleon retained his secret plan to require that one marriage in 3 be an intermarriage. Now questions 4 to 6. Questions 4 to 6 directly addressed citizenship. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brethren or as strangers? 5, in either case, what conduct does their law prescribe towards Frenchmen, not of their religion? 6, do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and to follow the directions of the civil code? 4 and 5 asked whether Jews consider themselves to be members of the nation as a family writ large. Did they maintain different ethical standards for Jews and Frenchmen? Question 6 asked whether Jews admitted to citizenship under the defunct laws of residence of jus soli. Do the Jews born in France and treated by the laws as French citizens in fact deserve that status? Do they regard France as their country and accept the requisite duties? Will they abide by the new civil code? The Assembly's answer to question 4 did not satisfy the commissioners. The answer quoted biblical passages about the treatment of the stranger and Talmudic passages enjoining love for, quote, our brethren who observe the Noahide laws, the 7 laws of Noah, which are a basis for Jews to practice toleration. The Assembly again scrupulously excluded Christians from the class of idolaters. The delegates then acknowledged their tie of gratitude for toleration that irrevocably linked their fate with the, quote, common fate of all Frenchmen. The commissioners declared that the Assembly had not addressed how the Jews regarded themselves. Were they, quote, a family, a tribe, or a specific people? The Assembly had either chosen not to respond to or had not comprehended the Civil Code's new definition of what it meant to be French. In answering question 5, the Assembly attempted to rectify its answer to the previous question. After declaring that Jews treat Frenchmen no differently than fellow Jews, the Assembly asserted, quote, at the present time, when the Jews no longer form a separate people, but enjoy the advantage of being incorporated with the great nation, which privilege they consider as a kind of political redemption, important phrase, it is impossible that a Jew should treat a Frenchman, not of his religion, in any other manner than he would treat one of his Israelitish brethren. The Assembly thereby renounced being a separate people. They also gave their claim to citizenship in France the weight of a quasi-messianic formulation, political redemption. The answer to the next question continued that line of argument in asserting that loyalty to France made them strangers to Jews elsewhere. Quote, a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers, although he may be among Jews. And the case is the same with English Jews in France. To drive this point home, especially to Napoleon, who was a general, the delegates asserted that Jews serving in the French army had been seen, quote, fighting desperately against other Jews, the subjects of countries then at war with France. Okay, now we go to the 7th through the 9th questions. The 7th through 9th questions concern the powers and jurisdictions of the rabbis. Napoleon had integrated Catholics and Protestants into his centralized state. Would he be able to do the same with the Jews? Do the rabbis possess authority that infringes on the states? 7, who elects the rabbis? 8, what kind of police jurisdiction have the rabbis among the Jews? What judicial power do they exercise among them? 9, are the forms of the elections of the rabbis and their police jurisdiction regulated by the law, or are they only sanctioned by custom? In answering question 7, the Assembly explained that since the Revolution, the election of rabbis had been irregular. To the 8th question, the Assembly responded that whereas Jews had had jurisdiction in their own land in antiquity, since their dispersion, their tribunals, quote, always depended on the will of governments under which the Jews have lived and on the degree of tolerance they have enjoyed. Since the Revolution, those rabbinical tribunals are totally suppressed in France and in Italy, because Italy was under Napoleonic or French control. The Jews, raised to the rank of citizens, have conformed in everything to the laws of the state. And accordingly, the functions of the rabbis, wherever they are established, are limited to preaching morality in the temples, blessing marriages, and pronouncing divorces. So the rabbis are no longer judges in courts. The answer to question 8 rendered 9 moot. We're almost at the end of the 12 questions. The 3 final questions concern Jewish commercial practices. Are there professions from which the Jews are excluded by their law? Does the law forbid the Jews from taking usury from their brethren? Does it forbid or does it allow usury towards strangers? So the question here is, do Jews have a dualist ethic? One set of principles for fellow Jews, another set of principles for non-Jews. The answer to the 10th question was a simple negative. Jews could practice all occupations, and fathers were enjoined to teach their sons an honorable occupation. In contrast, the 11th and 12th questions elicited sustained answers to the rebarbative and inflated allegations of usury in Alsace. The delegates answered that Moses had envisioned a, quote, nation of husbandmen in which there will be little trade beyond simple barter. Moreover, such laws as the sabbatical and jubilee years aim to encourage equality of property by restraining the accumulation of private property. So we're, a sort of rural agricultural idyll. The Bible conceived of lending as, quote, a principle of charity and not a commercial regulation. The Bible accordingly had only one word for interest and no separate notion of usury. The delegates thus concluded that, quote, the law of Moses forbids all manner of interest on loan between a Jew and his countrymen without distinction of religion. The delegates acknowledged that these laws applied to Jews when they inhabited their own state. In the qualitatively different circumstances of the diaspora, Jews, quote, lent money on interest to trading Jews as well as to men of different persuasions. The answer to question 12 expanded this view. There were no equivalents among Jews to the rebellions against rapacious creditors that had punctuated the histories of ancient Greece and Rome, for example. Taking interest from the stranger was only allowed, according to the Talmud, in commercial exchanges, that is, in commercial speculation, where the lender shares in the borrower's profit. Quote, it is an incontrovertible point, according to the Talmud, that interest, even among Israelites, is lawful in commercial operations where the lender, running some of the risk of the borrower, becomes a sharer in his profits. This is the opinion of all Jewish doctors. And they continued, if today a few Jews engage in the nefarious traffic of usury, then that is no reason to impute this evil to all Jews. Quote, would it not be deemed an injustice to lay the same imputation on all Christians because some of them are guilty of usury? Okay, that's the end of the second part. Put the handout aside. Okay? We now come to the third part, which is about the Sanhedrin, the Assembly of Notables becoming the Sanhedrin. Napoleon and his commissioners were sufficiently satisfied with these answers to want to make them legally binding. In their meeting with the assembly's rabbis, the commissioners realized that the assembly lacked legal standing because of its mixed composition of laymen and rabbis. A body composed primarily of rabbis, on the model of the ancient Sanhedrin, could transform the answers into legal rulings. Napoleon therefore decided to create a modern Sanhedrin. Rabbis would be 45 of its 70 members, to be drawn from throughout the empire. Napoleon and his commissioners carefully orchestrated the Sanhedrin, which met from February 4th to March 9th, 1807, to ensure its dignity and even more to prevent dissent. A committee of 9, which Sinsheim headed, drafted the rulings. 2 representatives then presented the rulings to the full Sanhedrin. In the plenary meetings, no discussion was allowed. The Sanhedrin considered 9 questions, omitting the 3 concerning the rabbinate, 7, 8, and 9. The Assembly of Notables had emphasized the supremacy of civil over religious law. The Sanhedrin stressed the distinction in Jewish law between eternally binding religious laws and time-bound political decrees that had lost their validity in the diaspora. In separate speeches to the Sanhedrin, Furtado and Sinsheim condemned usury, and by identifying persecution as its root cause, endeavored to exonerate their fellow Jews. In a concluding address in Hebrew, Sinsheim defended the Sanhedrin's rulings as arising solely from Jewish law. End of the Sanhedrin. Now we go back to the Assembly of Notables. Part 4. With the Sanhedrin's conclusion, the assembly resumed its meetings. Napoleon wanted to implement the 2 remaining items on his agenda. He planned to introduce an institutional structure which, modeled on the consistoire he had imposed on Protestants, would integrate the Jews into the centralized state. In many of its features, this plan followed one that Jewish notables had submitted on their own initiative at the end of 1805 or early in 1806. Napoleon's organization gave power to lay elites, especially those in Paris. It turned the rabbi into a state functionary. Rabbis had to sign a declaration to abide by the Sanhedrin's decisions, especially the supremacy of civil over religious law, and to provide the names of eligible conscripts for the army. Napoleon was concerned about having manpower for the army. By means of the consistoire, the French state was to make Judaism equal to Protestantism through a recognized legal status and the payment of rabbis' salaries. In fact, Napoleon's government in the end refused to assume responsibilities for those salaries. That wouldn't take place until 1830 and 31. Napoleon additionally wanted the assembly to provide justification for punitive laws for Alsace. Napoleon showed no compromise in his vituperative instructions. He wanted, quote, disciplinary measures. He thought some departments, namely Alsace, had become vassals to the Jews. That is, the Jews' suzerainty spread unceasingly through usury and mortgages. Therefore, he aimed, quote, to weaken, if not to destroy, the Jewish people's inclination to such a great number of practices which are contrary to civilization, close quote. He wanted legislation that for a 10-year period would limit the Jews' ability to lend money and engage in commerce. Moreover, He aimed to achieve that end by requiring that 1 marriage in 3 be an intermarriage, so that, quote, the Jew's blood will lose its particular character, since a mass of vitiated blood can be improved only through time. All right, so here he's talking about the notion of the French family. Napoleon's commissioners would implement his instructions, albeit with the notable exception of the required intermarriages. Somewhere along the way, they buried it. The commissioners pressured Furtado as president to propose a motion in which the assembly asked the government to take action to cure the habits of those who engaged in usury. Many of the delegates objected to any legislation that differentiated between Jews and other Frenchmen. The commissioners reassured them that the emperor had no such intention. After Furtado delivered a speech highlighting the need to draw a line between usurers and other Jews, the assembly passed the motion. Napoleon now had the legitimation he desired, although at the cost of deceiving Furtado and the assembly. 2 of the 3 measures promulgated on March 17, 1808, concern the establishment of the consistory and its administration. The 3rd decree addressed the suspension of payments of debts already in force for 2 years. It outlined strict provisions that favored the debtors. It stipulated government supervisions for the Jews' business dealings for 10 years. It introduced restrictions on residence in order to prevent further immigration. Finally, the decree required Jews to serve in person in the army, borrowing them from hiring surrogates, an option available to all other citizens. The decree itself exempted the Portuguese Jews of the Southwest from all these provisions. The Jews of Paris later requested and gained exemption as well. Some issues remained unresolved. No provisions had been made to retire community debts. Jewish leaders in the relevant regions established special organizations to ensure repayment. The state did not assume the payment of rabbi salaries. That issue would be resolved in 1830. The special oath for Jews serving as witnesses in courts was not abolished. The Court of Colmar codified it in 1809. End of part 4. Now the conclusion. Breathe a sigh of relief. Napoleon's measures repudiated the unconditional emancipation of September 27, 1791. Napoleon reverted to a conditional emancipation reminiscent of the punitive legislation that Rubel, a delegate from Alsace, had introduced on September 28, 1791. Napoleon drew on Ancien Regime precedents, going back before the revolution. The questions his commissioners drafted echoed those that the Malesherbes Commission had posed in 1787, 2 years before the revolution. The 3rd article of the legislation of March 17, 1808, that came to be known as the infamous decree restricting the Jews' economic pursuits and restricting residence, resembled Louis XVI's 1784 letters patent for the Jews of Alsace. In preparing the 3rd article, Napoleon's ministers, in fact, consulted Joseph II's edicts of the 1780s, the Habsburg emperor who had issued edicts of toleration, first for Protestants and Greek Orthodox in the Habsburg Empire, and then for Jews. It had been no accident then that Napoleon said he was convening an Estates General for the Jews. For the Jews of Alsace, he had effaced the revolution's romance, turning the clock back to May 1789 so as to treat them once again as foreigners. In fact, the administrative location of the new consistoire embodied this status. If the Jews were a religious group, they should have been under the jurisdiction of the minister of cults. If they were a foreign group, then they should have been under the Ministry of the Interior. The legislation placed them under both ministries. Thank you.
I think David will take
Please.
What a wonderful talk. What was the result in the lives of the Jews of France from these edicts and from the Sanhedrin?
Well, could everyone hear the question? What were the consequences for the Jews of France? First of all, the infamous decree which limited their economic activities and actually legislated in favor of debtors cost lots of Jews lots of money. It actually bankrupted lots of Jews and had lasting economic consequences for the Jews of Alsace. The consistory, which Napoleon created, did in fact become the governing body of Jews in France. It continued to be so until is it still the same today?
It still
Until
is.
the Second World War.
Until the separation of church and state, that's when it really officially
Oh, okay.
separated.
In 1905 it changed.
Yeah, but it's still there. It's just a
still there.
voluntary.
But what it meant is that you had a consistory for each of the different regions of France where there was enough Jewish population. Each consistory had a head rabbi, but then there was a central consistory in Paris which really had all the power, and that was under lay control, and there was also a chief rabbi. So it really put the control of the community in the hands of the lay elites in Paris, which was, which paralleled or mirrored French government, right? Because France is an extremely centralized state with the seat of power in Paris. So it had enormous consequences. And that model of the well, two things. First of all, go back to the infamous decree. The infamous decree was legislated for a decade. So it was slated to lapse in 1808, but Napoleon had actually written into it that if the Jews hadn't been regenerated and changed, it could be renewed. Now, of course, in 1818, when it came up for renewal, Napoleon was no longer in power. It was the Restoration under Louis XVIII. There were efforts to renew the infamous decrees, particularly from various notables and even courts in Alsace. The central consistory, which now existed, fought that renewal bitterly and actually won. And actually, I came across a little-known petition which the central consistory submitted in 1818, which uses, I was just blown away when I started reading this petition because the language is incredible. They called this decree a usurpation of justice. An exercise of despotic power. Now, of course, this is about Napoleon. Napoleon's gone. So, they're not accusing Louis XVIII. So, they're free, in some ways, free to do that. Nevertheless, it's extremely bold language. And they succeeded in averting a renewal. However, the infamous decree had also been enforced in other parts of Europe that had been under French occupation, particularly in parts of the Rhineland in Germany. And there, in some states, it remained in force until 1848. In Congress Poland, which had been created by, or the Duchy of Warsaw created by Napoleon, which then became Congress Poland, it was used as a way of depriving Jews of their rights, because the Duchy of Warsaw and Congress Poland actually used the Napoleonic Code. In principle, Jews should have had equality, but the government used the infamous decree as a pretext to deprive them of rights. The consistory also had an impact elsewhere in Europe. In some of the German states that had been under French rule, the Jewish community was actually organized according to the principle of the centralized consistory. And of course, the decisions of the Assembly of Notables and the Sanhedrin became the symbol for emancipation and for the Jews' own ideology of emancipation. And those decisions were repeated and reiterated and ratified and confirmed time and again. Please.
So so obviously it was very difficult for the Jews to bring up their opinions for the Napoleon and the French authority. But also I was wondering they are also responsible for their communities. So I was wondering what if there was any reaction of Jews abroad in places such as London and Amsterdam to the rabbis' kind of rabbinic decrees and their negotiations.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mention Amsterdam and London, because Sinsheim, as I mentioned, did correspond with rabbinic authorities throughout Europe. The rabbinic authorities he corresponded with were not in Amsterdam and London. From the point of view of an Ashkenazic rabbi from Alsace, who was an expert in the Talmud, there were no Talmudic authorities in Amsterdam and London. The Talmudic authorities were in Central Europe, in East Central Europe, in Poland. And those are the people that he corresponded with. And he did, yeah.
After they enacted their declarations, did that kind of affect their standing as halachic Jews?
No, okay. Not at all. Not at all. Because, the dictum, the law of the land is law, Dina Dina, which comes from the Babylonian Talmud, had been used as the basis of Jewish communal law in relationship to external authority for 2 millennia, right? And that dictum embodied both submission and resistance, meaning to say, if on the basis of that law, you saw the law that was being imposed, and usually it was a physical law, it was a tax, as being just, then you could recognize it and submit to it. If, on the other hand, you saw the law as being unjust, as the tax levy being excessive, and the term for that would be sort of state extortion, gzela de mochuta. If you saw it that way, then you could actually resist. Now, what were the means for resistance? You could say, no, I'm not going to pay the tax, and the authorities could say, fine, leave. The Jews could pick up and leave. I mean, one of the major means of resistance that Jews as a minority had in the diaspora was mobility. They weren't tied to the land. They weren't tied to cities. They could pick up and go. It's an extreme thing to do. Probably better to negotiate than to resort to that extreme. But nevertheless, that possibility of resistance was built in. But in the case of the Sanhedrin, it wasn't felt that they had caved in, right? They did extend the application of that dictum from physical matters to ritual matters, but the rabbinic authorities throughout Europe agreed with Sinsheim that under the circumstances this was permissible, right? And Jewish law was always a flexible system, like any system of law, right? It's kind of a conversation, right? How do we interpret this principle now? How is it interpreted then? How do we interpret it under new circumstances and apply it in a justifiable manner? Please.
I'm struck by just one tiny detail, which is the use of the term Sanhedrin, which you described as bombastic too. So I'm curious, whose idea was it to
call it that?
To call
Napoleon.
It that? But I mean, what's the genesis of that? There has to be a story there. And what was the reaction of Jews to this? Because it's not in any way that a Jew might recognize as a real. It's not really a Sanhedrin.
Well, there was a Sanhedrin in the ancient world,
yeah,
right?
That's what I'm saying.
So
it seems odd to call this that, and I wonder if they were flattered by this, or if they found it to be a bit bombastic, as you said, and even maybe a bit out of place, or was this even discussed? And where did Napoleon come upon the word too?
Well, his commissioners found it. I don't think Napoleon himself knew about it. But right, after all, Napoleon was an incredible showman, right? He was histrionic, right? And so it was not out. Think about when he was crowned emperor, right? You know, was it the Pope who was there or a cardinal who was supposed to put the crown on Napoleon? Napoleon didn't wait. He grabbed it and put it on his own head, right? He was a showman, right? He dominated the media. So calling this a Sanhedrin was perfectly in keeping. Now, some historians have argued recently that, you know, what we should see the Sanhedrin as part of Napoleon's larger program of legitimating his imperial authority, right? Because he'd only recently become emperor, right? When the Civil Code was passed in 1804, he was a co-ruler. It was only a couple of years later that he was crowned emperor. You know, there might be something to that this was part of his grand performance. In fact, there's a kind of painting which has become a cliche, which shows the great Emperor Napoleon with wearing his crown and his scepter, sort of according equality to the Jews and lifting them up out of the oppression of millennium. And you know, there's something, that's the image he wanted to convey. Now, there are sources for reactions of Jews to the Sanhedrin, let's say, in Eastern Europe, who saw this as an historic occasion, who saw Napoleon as the great liberator when he invaded Eastern Europe, when he invaded Russia, and also because of the Sanhedrin saw him as the great liberator of the Jews, right? And that maybe perhaps this was the beginning of the Messianic era, right? Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, you know, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. So there are various reactions to Napoleon. Ed.
I just wanted to get your take on the system of the consistoire. The extent that I've sort of looked at it, it's always struck me that this is Napoleon codifying the system of the state within the state. And in fact, I can see in a sense of a throwback to an Ancien Regime system of communities, which are in one way or another under the state. Only Napoleon is using his own code in order to do it. Do you get that sense of continuity?
With the earlier
Yeah.
Well, look, yes and no, in the sense that the consistory is no longer a corporate body, right? It no longer has specific privileges legislated by a charter, right? So it's part of the state mechanism. On the other hand, there are aspects of the consistory which continue functions of the older autonomous community, particularly that the community has to pay rabbis' salaries, the community doesn't get funding from the state. But, you know, I think those are rather, those are sort of the ambiguities and contradictions of emancipation, right? You see the same thing in Russia, right? That when Russia tries to, in the legislation of 1804, when it tries to create a comprehensive legislation for the first time for Jews who have come under Russian control with the partitions of Poland, it does away with it tries to legislate away the autonomous community as a corporate body, yet it nonetheless delegates to the Jews tax collecting functions and paying taxes to the state. That would seem to be a contradiction, at least in terms of the principle of doing away with the community as a corporate body. But you see those kinds of contradictions and tensions and inconsistencies all over Europe. So, I mean, I think the main thing is that, you know, the consistory is part of the mechanism of the state. The rabbi is turned into a functionary of the state. The rabbi now has to keep the register of births and deaths. The rabbi has to report to the state when young men become eligible for conscription. The rabbi has to announce French laws in the synagogue, and the rabbi has to abide by the decisions of the Sanhedrin and recognize the superiority of civil law to halacha. Does that? No question, Laura?
No, I missed half the talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'll save them for dinner. I came in late.
All right, in that case, we'd like to thank you.